Good evening. My name is Joe Levenstein, and I am with the Adams County Jewish Community in Gettysburg. And I'm happy to be hosting tonight for you. If you'll hold on a second, there we go. The topic for tonight is Jewish Perspectives on Biomedical Ethics, and it's provided under the auspices of the Central Pennsylvania Small Congregations Initiative, which brings together 15 congregations from the region. Now, the conveners of this group are the Jewish Community Foundation of Central Pennsylvania and the Jewish Community Legacy Project. A few logistical details first. The program, as you just heard, is being recorded, and it will be saved on the Jewish Community Foundation YouTube channel for later viewing. And again, everyone will be muted with the exception of the speakers. So if for some reason you become unmuted, please hit your mute button again. You are encouraged to submit questions and comments via the chat. And if the questions are not answered by the end of the meeting, we will be sending them out via email. Okay, due to requests from earlier programs, tonight's session will conclude around 8:15. Now, biomedical ethics is an intensely personal issue for most of us because we will almost all be touched by them sometime in our lives. As a simple example, most of us will someday find ourselves, if we haven't already, lying on a gurney or a hospital bed awaiting some kind of a medical procedure. And some strange person will come up to us and identify themselves as an anesthetist or a nurse anesthetist. And they'll ask you a few questions about your health and then describe how you will receive your anesthesia. And then you'll sign a paper acknowledging that the discussion took place. Now, this is called informed consent, and it's an ethical requirement for most medical and allied medical specialties today. Informed consent is part of my own practice as a clinical psychologist. Now, many practitioners confuse risk management and ethics. Risk management involves avoidance of lawsuits and or discipline by one's professional board. However, biomedical ethics take us to a much higher level where the good of the patient is of paramount importance. Even in this relatively trivial example, I found that in my own practice, it's a good way to help ease people's anxieties and can motivate them in the early stages of treatment. Behaving ethically is not an abstraction. It is good clinical practice, and Judaism has much to say about biomedical ethics. Now, we'll begin tonight with our keynote speaker, Dr. Jonathan Crane, who serves as the Raymond F. Shinazi Scholar in Bioethics and Jewish Thought at Emory Center for Ethics. A professor of medicine and director of the Food Studies and Ethics Initiative, Jonathan is past president of the Society of Jewish Ethics, founder and co-editor of the Journal of Jewish Ethics, and author or editor of several books. And these books include Narratives and Jewish Bioethics in 2013, the Oxford Handbook of Jewish Ethics and Morality, 2013 again, the Beastly Morality, Animals as Ethical Agents in 2015, Eating Ethically, Religion and Science for a Better Diet, 2018, and Judaism, Race, and Ethics, Conversations and Questions in 2020. Following Jonathan's presentation, we will have responses and a discussion with him from two panelists from our community. I encourage you to submit questions and comments again during the chat. We're now ready to begin tonight's program, and it is now my pleasure to call on Jonathan Crane.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Joe. I really appreciate it. And good evening to everybody from lovely Atlanta. I hope that you are all doing well. And it is my pleasure to join the conversation in this series to learn with you about what Judaism might have to say about ethics, especially when it comes to ethics at the end of life. I'm going to share my screen, and I have a whole bunch of different slides, and it's going to go by really fast. So I hope that you have paper and pencil nearby, because there will be probably something along the way that will pique your curiosity. And I really do encourage you to write down a question or comment or concern. and share that with us as we progress through the evening. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So tonight we're going to talk about dying to die and what Judaism might have to say about what sort of interventions are appropriate and justifiable as we reach the end of our lives. So some of the topics that we're going to talk about are differentiating, understanding certain terms that are appropriate for end-of-life conversations. Then we'll talk about withdrawing care, palliation, assisting somebody who's trying to die or is in the throes of dying, certifying what is actually death according to the Judaic textual tradition. What about autopsies and cutting into their bodies? And then finally, transplanting some organs. So you can see we're going to cover a huge landscape this evening. And hopefully one or two of these issues will pique your curiosity. So buckle your seatbelt, and here we go. So it's important for us to get a sense of the landscape out there of what sort of issues are being promoted in different kinds of states. So this is a recent map put out by Death with Dignity, a nonprofit organization that really does a wonderful job of both educating and advocating for death with dignity legislation. And since you're in Pennsylvania, this is where you are. At least in recent years, there have been some pieces of legislation that have been under consideration. I do not know, unfortunately, what is the current status of those legislations. But you can see that at least as of relatively recently, there are a few states that actually protect the possibility for a person who is interested in dying to actually be in control of her actual final moments. So this raises the question, when does dying begin? And if this were a class and we had unlimited time, we would have a lengthy conversation about this. Maybe you can throw it up into the chat right now, what you think when dying begins. I suspect that somebody will say it begins at birth. Or maybe somebody will say that dying begins even at conception. Maybe you think dying begins at bris. Maybe it begins when you graduate from medical school. Who knows when dying actually begins? But it could be that dying begins when you are diagnosed with a terminal illness. Or maybe it's a prognosis that you begin dying once the prognosis is such that it has a particular kind of outcome, say 3 days, 6 months, whatever it is. Or maybe it is independent of our diagnosis and prognosis. Maybe somebody begins to die when our medical protocols and interventions are no longer curative and therefore ineffective. So that's one of the questions that I would want to spend some more time with you on. But let's keep that in the back of our mind. Some terminology that often you will find in contemporary Jewish biomedical discourse when talking about end-of-life issues are these two categories, the treifa and the goses. The treifa is somebody who has been diagnosed with some sort of terminal illness. And this allows for and inspires, even permits, and if not requires, certain kinds of interventions. And this is going to be distinct from a goses, which is somebody whose demise is imminent. Now, what does imminent mean? Well, according to traditional Jewish bioethicists, that means that this person is about to die within 72 hours. However, even though J. David Bleich promotes that particular concept, Jeffrey Rubenstein shows that classic Jewish texts actually think more broadly that it's not just 3 days, but it's actually more expansive. Be that as it may, what we're interested in is not the temporal horizon, but what are you allowed to do in that particular category? So if you are categorized within the bucket called the treifa, it actually means that you are obliged to intervene if you're a healthcare provider in that particular patient who has been determined to be a treifa. And if you are also the patient yourself, you are permitted to engage in different kinds of experiments. So it's a two-way street here. Intervention is obligatory and required, and you may also participate as a research subject. However, if you are in a goses state, there are certain things that need to now happen. One, healthcare providers should not, must not hasten that individual's death, and concomitantly, neither prolong that patient's dying. So this is a fine-edged sword here once you reach the goses stage. And we'll see how that plays out later on in just a few minutes. So let's start with one of the first interventions, which is actually withdrawal or perhaps withholding of interventions. And this text is coming from the Shulchan Aruch, Tractate Yoreh De'ah. This is a very famous text. Shulchan Aruch was written by Joseph Caro in the late 16th century, 17th century. And this is the comment by Isserles, the Mapa, who is now providing the Ashkenazic interpretation or layer on top of the Sephardic rules that Joseph Caro was articulating. And so what Isserles is saying on this particular law is that it's forbidden to do anything that might bring the acceleration of an individual's death, even for somebody whose dying is taking a long time and does not have the capacity to withdraw, who doesn't have the energy to say to loved ones and healthcare providers, I've had enough. If this person is incommunicado, what do you do? So if there is some factor which is preventing the exit of the soul, such as a nearby wood chopper, or maybe there's salt placed underneath that patient's tongue, and these are stimulating that patient so much so that they are impeding the dying process, it is permissible to remove those stimuli. Because in doing so, one actively does nothing but remove an obstacle that is preventing his natural death. So this particular classic resource is almost unanimously interpreted to mean that according to the Judaic textual tradition, to halakha and to its ethical principles, that you are permitted to withdraw interventions that keep a patient alive and keep a patient animated, I should say, beyond what their death would otherwise transpire. And so we should take a look at the different kinds of stimuli. One is the wood chopper. So this is something that is audible and exogenous. It's outside of the particular patient. So maybe there are beeps and whirs and machinery or something outside of the patient that is stimulating the patient enough, keeping them aware, even though they might be in some sort of cognitive status, like a vegetative state, but it's stimulating them sufficiently that they are no longer able to follow through on the dying process. So these external stimuli, it is permissible to eliminate them so as to allow that person to die. The other kind of stimuli is an endogenous, something inside the patient. So maybe that patient is in extraordinary pain, for example. And one question then is, can you remove that pain so much so that that patient then can actually find some relief? So let's turn our question to that, which is about palliation and anesthesiology. So I don't recommend this, which is, I'm blanking on I'm blinking on the phrenation or something like that, where you're actually drilling holes into the skull. I don't recommend that as a mechanism to relieve a headache, but it was a classic medicinal intervention, thousands of years old. But the Judaic textual tradition while it does not want you to drill holes into a person's brain, you are permitted, according to the book of Proverbs, to give somebody a strong intoxicant of some sort, so that especially to somebody who's dying. Why? According to Maimonides, the Mishneh Torah, and he's also supported by several sources in the Babylonian Talmud, this is all the more so. So here the rule is about somebody who has confessed to a capital crime. And if he is found guilty of a capital crime, he's given a granule of frankincense dissolved in a cup of wine in order to teruf hada'at, it says in the Hebrew, to rip his knowledge about this and therefore become vishnikerd. That is a true Hebrew and Yiddish word, to become drunk. And only once he has reached this stage of complete inebriation, then you are permitted to execute him for in the manner for which he is liable. And there are 4 different ways to execute criminals of capital crimes. So the logic goes like this. If it is the case that somebody who is guilty of a capital crime is permitted, if not required, to be anesthetized about their impending death, then all the more so for somebody who is innocent but is scheduled to die according to their biomedical circumstance, that person can also be anesthetized so that they no longer are aware of their condition or of the pain that they are experiencing. So palliation, I think, gets a fairly strong moral and legal thumbs up from the Judaic textual tradition. Now here, we're going to spend a few moments on this text. This comes from the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Avodah Zarah, which is the tractate that discusses idolatry. And it's going to be talking about what to do when somebody is in the throes of dying. What kinds of interventions, what kind of assistance are you permitted to provide? And this is a long sugya, which means that it's a fairly lengthy conversation, storyline. And so it's going to take us a few moments to go through it, to see the complexity of this particular story. It begins this way, that it's only a couple of days have passed since Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma had died, and all of the elite of Rome went to bury him and eulogize him with a great eulogy. So all of Rome has now left Jerusalem. And they are going out to, this is not Jerusalem, I'm sorry, this is Yavne. They've now left to go bury Rabbi Yossi. Upon returning, they found Rabbi Hananiah ben Teradion sitting and engaging in Torah. So he was teaching, he was convening substantial gatherings, and he had a Torah scroll resting on his lap. This was anathema to the Roman community. And we should unpack why that is. It was anathema because according to the Roman rules for Jews who were living in Roman ruled Palestine, is that they were permitted to be Jewish as long as they, 1, did not teach in public square, 2, that they did not convene large gatherings in the public arena, and 3, that they did not parade Judaic symbols, religious symbols in public. Any one of those would have been a capital crime in Roman-ruled Israel. And so here is Rabbi Hananiah, who's doing a triple whammy. So it raises the question. He knew the rules of the land. Was he asking to be killed because his friend and colleague, Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma, had just recently died? We don't know. But we do know that what happened is that the Romans brought Rabbi Hananiah ben Teradion, they wrapped him in his Torah scroll, they placed piles of twigs around him and lit them aflame. Moreover, they brought tufts of wool soaked in water and they placed those things on his heart so that his soul would not depart quickly. Now, if we stopped our reading here, this is thick enough to begin to suggest that there might be some Judaic attitudes about assisting somebody who is in their throes of dying. But the story continues on. His daughter approaches him and says, "Daddy, to see you this way." He replies to his daughter, "Were I to be burned alone, it would be a difficult matter. Now, as it is me who burns and the Torah scroll is with me, the one who will address the affront to the Torah scroll will also address the affront to me." That's a profound conversation. It seems that what he wants to convey to his daughter is, don't worry. These are my convictions. This is what I believe in. In other words, this is my ethical will, and I'm bequeathing this set of beliefs and convictions and faith to you, my daughter. This is, however, not the end of the story. His students now approach him and they say, "Teacher, what do you see?" And he replies to them, "The parchment burns, but the letters soar." They say, "Open your mouth so that the fire can enter you." And he replies, "It is better that the one who takes it is the one who gave it. One should not injure oneself." So this is interesting. Now his students are coming up to him as if to perhaps console him in his dying moments while the flames are licking at his flesh. But rather, what do they say? They say, teacher, what do you see? They put him not as a person, but as a role. They want to see him as a rabbi, as a teacher, rather than as a person in the thick of his own demise. And so in this awkward collegial moment, there one more lesson, and he complies. He says, the parchment burns, but the letters soar. What a beautiful expression that is, that even though Rome can destroy material aspects of Judaism and can even burn my body, that Rome can never touch revelation itself. Revelation, the ink, the black letters, those are soaring on high back to the source where they can be promulgated again. Revelation will continue to occur, he says. They suggest, well, why don't you open your mouth and asphyxiate? Well, he says, that's not for me to do. For the one who takes it is the one who gave it. It is better for the one who takes it is the one who gave it. And the it here is kind of ambiguous. It probably means life. So who is it that gives life? Well, that must be God. And then he articulates this general principle. One should not injure oneself. Now, if we stopped our reading here, it is obvious what the Judaic textual tradition, and this text in particular, says about intervening in somebody's demise. And we'll get to that in just a moment. However, the story doesn't end here. It continues on. The executioner now comes and says, teacher, if I increase the flames and remove the tufts of wool from your heart, will you bring me to the world to come? The Olam Haba? And Hananiah says, of course. So swear to me, says the executioner. And so he swore to him. And he immediately increased the flames, removed the tufts of wool from Hananiah's heart. His soul quickly departed. And then the executioner jumped and fell into the fire. Now, if this is where you stopped your reading, again, you can get a sense of what the Judaic textual tradition, and this one in particular, suggests about the permissibility or the impermissibility of intervening in somebody's demise. The story doesn't end there. A bat kol comes along and says, Rabbi Hananiah ben Teradion and the executioner have both been assigned to the Olam Haba, to the world to come. Rabbi Judah Hanasi, however, cries. He's saying some acquire his eternal world in one moment, whereas another acquires his eternal world in many years. So we've got two different evaluations of what has just transpired. We have a divine heavenly voice saying they've both reached the Olam Haba, and we've got a terrestrial, earthly, human voice saying, why? Why is it that both have acquired their eternal reward, where one gets it from an act of what seems to be goodwill, whereas the other had to work hard, study, and be righteous throughout his whole life, and only then acquires his eternal reward in the Olam Haba. So now the story becomes even more complicated. And this is the end of the story. So how is it unpacked by contemporary bioethicists? Well, some of them focus in on this principle that one should not injure oneself. And they interpret this principle to mean that, well, frankly, you should not commit suicide. Others say, well, obviously, this is saying that physician-assisted suicide is also not kosher. Some say, well, obviously, this is clearly talking about passive euthanasia. Others are saying this is in reference to active euthanasia. And all of them say that because of this principle, one should not injure oneself. You shouldn't do none of these kinds of activities when somebody is dying. Others in the contemporary Jewish bioethical conversations, they point to this part of the sugya, about the conversation between the executioner and Hananiah. And they see in this particular snippet of that where he is offering to remove the tufts of wool, well, obviously this is in reference to passive euthanasia, about withdrawing care from an individual. It's not about pushing the final dose of morphine, it's about withdrawing the ventilator, for example. Others of them say, well, wait a second, look at how he says that he's going to increase the flames. That is very much akin, according to their interpretation. That is very much like pushing that last dose of morphine. And so this is active euthanasia. And both of these are considered to be permitted according to this particular reading of this sugya. Others look at the whole conversation between Hananiah and the executioner, and they say, well, let's take a look at the context. What is the nature of autonomy, of consent, as Joe was talking about at the very beginning? What sort of consent does he articulate in this matter? And some see that he's giving free assent to the plan that the executioner provides. And therefore, this is giving permission to both voluntary euthanasia and involuntary euthanasia. Both would be supported in this reading. Others, however, see that, well, wait a second. Hananiah is on a pyre. He's burning at the stake. His flesh is dripping off of him. He did not ask to be there. And so he is in a situation where he can't do anything but consent to what, or agree with what the executioner is saying. And so for these readers, this is a moment of duress, which means that neither active nor path of euthanasia is going to be justifiable according to this sugya. So if you're not confused yet, that text, that whole sugya is so problematic that it is internally ambivalent, meaning that it has both pro-interventions as well as anti-intervention attitudes. And it's also ambiguous because in one moment to his daughter, he says, don't do anything, don't worry. I'm okay, this is a status quo, and here's my ethical will that I want to give to you. To his students, he's saying, don't do anything whatsoever, and I'm not going to do anything either. Whereas to the executioner, he's saying, yes, of course, do. Let's hasten this. Get me out of here. So it's internally ambivalent, and it's also ambiguous because Hananiah ben Teradion doesn't die just once in the rabbinic textual tradition. He dies 4 times. 4 times in the Midrashim and several times in the Talmud, he dies. This story comes, but none of the stories are actually the exact same. So which death is it that he actually died? And in fact, when you look at those 4 stories, chronologically, the one that is closest to his death is about 200 years after he actually died. And then as you creep closer to the Avodah Zarah text, which is the one that we read, it is the one that is the furthest away temporally or chronologically from his death. It was composed around the year 700 CE, whereas he died around the year 200 CE. 500 years after he died. How much telephone and game can you play with that? How much corruption is in that story is found in this Avodah Zarah text. So it's really unclear which story, which of those 4 stories should we as contemporary bioethicists read and interpret and then guide contemporary Jews when they are trying to think about what to do about a loved one who is in their dying phases, whether they should assist or not assist in their dying. So it raises many questions. It's internal and ambivalence and the textual tradition's ambiguity. And then there's also the halachic question, which says that you should never render a rule according to somebody who has died for Torah, for teaching Torah. And there are 0 rulings in the Talmud that are actually articulated in Hananiah ben Teradion's name. So why should we as contemporary bioethicists defer to him to create norms for contemporary Jewry? That is a whole story. But now let's continue on with our conversation tonight about certifying. What is death? So if you had to define death, which is distinct from dying. So death is something else. What is it? Well, there are many possible definitions. Perhaps it's a failure of the body. Maybe it's a failure of medicine. Maybe it's a state. When we say something like, she has been dead for 3 years, that is describing a state of existence. So being dead or death is another kind of existence. Maybe death is a terminus, that there's nothing more, boom, period. Or maybe it's liminal. It's a doorway to some other kind of existence. Maybe it is to the Olam Haba. Maybe actually death is a form of activity. It's something that the body is doing. Because when you look very closely at the cells and at the organs, they're doing things, even though there's no longer cohesion of the whole organism. Organs are doing something or not doing something, but there are activities at the micro level. And then some might say that death is actually an achievement. Because if you think about it evolutionarily, we are designed evolutionarily to die. Our bodies have, our cells and DNA have telomeres, and senescence is built into the very way that our bodies age, mature, and senesce. And so perhaps it is the ultimate achievement of what it means to exist is death, that this is the final and ultimate process or step for an organism. So what is death? Well, there are many options here. Judaism has provided a variety of different ways of sort of identifying an individual who has died. So at the earliest level, it was understood to be breathing, that if breath is present, then this person is most likely alive. If breath is absent, this person is most definitely dead. Later on, in the rabbinic period, we add the notion of a heartbeat. Well, it's possible for an individual to hold his or her breath for a long time. But if there's no heartbeat, that person's breath is never going to return. And so they began to shift the definition of death to a cardio definition. It was later that they began to put those two together and say, you need to have both. That if both the breath and the heartbeat are missing, that person is then dead. And it was only a couple of decades ago, after the ad hoc committee at Harvard in 1969 promoted the idea of brain death, and that's a political enterprise in and of itself, that the Jewish communities began to embrace this definition of death. And there's different forms of brain death. Is it the whole brain? Is it the brain stem? Is it a partial brain? How much of the brain needs to no longer be functioning to constitute death? Those are more details than we need to get into. But we can say that for the most part, most of contemporary Judaism, most streams of contemporary Judaism have embraced brain death as a legitimate way to identify somebody who has indeed died. Now, what do you do when somebody has died? Are you allowed to cut into them and engage in an autopsy? Well, if it was going to look like this, where the person's intestines are spilling off the table and a dog is eating it, no wonder people would say, no, thank you, I don't want that. And they would justify this idea of rejecting an autopsy based on the principle of kavod hamet, of honoring the dead. And they think that doing an autopsy is impermissible. And they rely upon a variety of different halachot about honoring the dead. You need to quickly bury them. No benefit may be derived from a corpse, and you are not allowed to violate a corpse. And so all of these would lead people to say autopsy is impermissible. Thankfully, medicine is much less chaotic than that picture. Rembrandt offers a more hygienic and stoic version. Autopsies are usually done in calmer environs. And therefore, this allowed for Jews to pursue invoking other kinds of principles like chesed, compassion, and pikuach nefesh, or saving a life, to justify and render permissible making an autopsy. And they add on a variety of different legal ways to granularize, if that's a verb, or detail why it is permissible to do an autopsy. If 3 physicians cannot ascertain why this particular patient died, then that is a reason enough to justify doing an autopsy. Or if 3 physicians attest that others can be saved from the knowledge that you would derive from this particular patient. Or if there is a hereditary disease that might safeguard relatives, and if the law requires it, if there's a forensic reason. These are all justified from the Judaic perspective to go ahead and cut into a corpse. Now, once you've cut into the corpse, what about taking those organs that are harvestable, that are still viable? Well, there's two different ways of doing transplantation. One is through living donors. And so contemporary Jewish bioethicists have said, well, this is an incredible gift. It's an extraordinary charity, but it is not an obligation. So if you have the opportunity to give, say, a kidney or a cornea that you no longer need or want, you are permitted to give it, but it's not an obligation. However, when it comes to giving organs after one has died, contemporary bioethicists say that this is not just a voluntary fulfillment of lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, but it is actually a commanded obligation. There is increasing call among Jewish communities to understand that cadaveric organ transplantation is not just a good, but a must, an obligation. So we have covered a huge swath of the landscape of issues around final interventions, and I hope that we can continue the conversation with your perspectives and questions. So thank you very much.
Joe, why don't you introduce the panelists?
All right. I was just waiting to come up on the screen there. All right. Thank you very much, Jonathan. We're now going to ask our two panelists to each make some brief comments, and then I'll facilitate a discussion with Jonathan and the panelists. Now, the first of our panelists is Steve Wassner. He's Emeritus Professor of Pediatrics, the Penn State University College of Medicine, and the Milton Hershey Medical Center, Distinguished Educator, Penn State Hershey Medical Center. Steve specialized in pediatric kidney disease research and treatment, and has been published in many academic and medical publications. His interests extend to Jewish medical ethics, the ethics of transplants, and the Holocaust. Steve?
Thank you, Jonathan. That was a lovely survey of the field. I enjoyed listening very much. I'd like to focus on one area of what I did, which is transplantation. I did not actually do the surgery, but I was involved in the care of many of these children. And I am neither a rabbi nor a lawyer, but I want to speak a little bit about the similarities between the legal system in both the American system and the Judaic system as I understand them. Both of them rely on precedent. Of course, in Judaism, you rely on the Torah, the Talmud, later on, the Shulchan Aruch. The other point is that both of them don't deal in hypotheticals. Both of them wait for the question to be asked. So until the question of transplantation came up, there were really no answers to the question itself. One of the problems with any treatment for the rabbinical law student is this treatment going to work? There is a clear distinction between putting yourself at risk for a known therapy and an unknown therapy. For example, can you harm yourself, potentially wound yourself for a kidney transplant that will only have a 5% chance of success? All right, there are risks involved. I'd like to, even though I've done kidney and not heart transplantation, I'd like to pick on heart transplants because that's really the essence, or the hardest, or the simplest to draw distinctions between. Early on, cardiac transplantation was an abject failure. All right, from 67, when the first heart transplant was done, until the early 80s, success rates were horribly low. They didn't have the right medications. They didn't have the right methodology to check for transplant rejection. And the Orthodox community said, look, this is not something we have to speak about. Success rates are so small. We don't have to talk about the problems of it. It's not successful. By the time you get into the 80s, a doctor named Shumway at Stanford did a great deal of work. Transplants were in the 80% success rate. As you heard from Jonathan, there was initially a physician-led process to make brain death a viable criteria. Brain death was never really thought about in Judaic law. It was very clear what the problem was. I can speak about the Orthodox approach because that was essentially started or pushed through by a single rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who during the last half, at least, of the 20th century was the preeminent rabbinic posek or rabbinic decider for Orthodox Judaism. And I know about this not because I've spoken to Moshe Feinstein, but I have spoken to his son-in-law who worked with him, Rav Moshe Tendler, who was both the head of the biology department at Yeshiva University and an expert on Jewish medical ethics until his death very recently. And he said that to make the determination that in fact brain death was brain death, it took Rabbi Feinstein 2 years. He met and spoke with neurologists, neurosurgeons, pulmonologists, cardiologists, pediatric nephrologists, internist nephrologists. They used to call on Saturday night to a hospital in Brooklyn that was known to have a fair number of people who, for gunshot wounds or whatever, were lying there in what would be called a brain death state. And they would literally visit the hospital. I guess in those days, in the 80s, if you were a rabbi, they'd let you in. The rules about visitation are somewhat tighter now. And according to Rav Moshe Tendler, he would sit at the bedside. He would examine the patient or hold his hand up, let it fall, and he'd say, tight, this person is dead, all right? And it was only after a 2-year study of the text, both religiously, scientifically, that he was able to make his decision that had the rabbis of olden times known that it was the brain stem that directed the heart, that led to breath, okay? They would also, the limits of their medical knowledge were, it's well accepted that you're not required to live by the medical knowledge of Talmudic times. So he made that statement. And while, as Jonathan said, there are people who disagree, his standing in the community, in the religious community, both here and in Israel, was sufficient to allow that his psak, his ruling, to take effect. And in fact, the ruling or heart transplants are performed in Israel at this point. I want to take just 2 minutes and talk about one other thing, skin grafts. Skin grafting, there was no skin bank in Israel before the 1973 war. The problem was that skin could not be used immediately. It had to be stored. And there is a rule in Judaism that while you can defile the dead, for immediate benefits, as noted by Jonathan, those 4 things, you can't do it for future benefits. So there were no skin banks. In 1973, there was a horrible war in which tanks were destroyed, leading to immense fires. There is pig skin. First of all, there are great benefits to using skin to cover an open burn wound. Pain goes away, healing takes place. It's immensely important. There were none in Israel at that time. Israel was getting skin from other countries' skin banks, and they ran out of pig skin, which can be used. Pigs, I hesitate to say it, but are very close to humans. In fact, you may know some. Okay, having said that, it was the necessity of skin banking that led to a reconsideration by the rabbis in Israel to allow skin banking to take place. And while they couldn't change the previous rulings, they were able to make a takana, a change, to say that in today's world, there'll always be a need for skin. There are enough people being burned. so that there is no concern about the skin going to waste. So the point I'm trying to make is that halacha changes in response to needs, maybe sooner than well, never sooner than we'd like, but maybe it takes longer than we like, but it's a process of the need appearing and a way of finding the brilliant rabbis are those who are ones who consider the rules and are allowed or find a way to do what's necessary. I'll do what's necessary here and stop talking.
Joe, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Joe, you're muted.
Joe, you've been on mute.
Here we go. Okay, is that better? Okay. So the second of our panelists is Dr. Stephen Berg, who's professor of history at Shippensburg University of Pennsylvania with a specialty in public history. His research includes work on the history of public health, particularly the social impact and responses to the influential pandemic of the influenza pandemic of 1918 in the United States. Steve has also team taught a course entitled Viruses in History as part of the Shippensburg University Honors College. He served as the advisor to the Shippensburg University Hillel, the Jewish Students Organization, since 1999, and he is a member of Temple Beth Shalom in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. Steve?
Thank you. And I just want to say, Jonathan, that was a phenomenal overview. And Steve W., I really appreciate your sharing your practical experiences. I'm a historian. I have to say that my experience is very different. And one of the things that, as we have been thinking about these issues, as somebody who teaches world history spanning back to the beginning of civilization, it's just, and sorry for my cat making an appearance, it's just remarkable to me to think about the fact that we live in a world where science and technology and chemistry have so radically transformed the nature of healthcare, altered the human lifespan, and really in so many ways changed the experience of illness, death, and dying from the historical context where a lot of these Jewish ethical principles first began. And so I think one of the things that both Jonathan and Steve were talking about is how do we take these principles from the ancient world and apply them to the modern world in a way that both recognizes the core values, but also recognizes the differences of the time in which we live. And so one of the things that it was actually Steve's comments were really very much aligned with some of the things that I was most curious about, because I was really curious as from a practical perspective, and this may lead just directly into a question for you here, Jonathan. You talked about those conferences that had occurred in the 80s where the questions of death were being discussed. I was really curious if you could, talk about the ways that in a practical setting and in a contemporary way, the kinds of things that you discussed. I was thinking about the example of the rabbi being burned alive and the very contradictory and ambiguous interpretations that you laid out on the table. How for modern medical practitioners do we take what really is a complex series of historical laws and stories and values and really put them into practice in a way that feels, recognizes modern circumstances, and at the same time respects the historical values. So I'm curious if you could, I know Steve commented on a bit from his experience with heart transplants and skin transplants, but I was wondering if you might be able to go further about how we take this, ancient traditions and really put them into practice in practical settings. The other thing that I wanted, if you might just comment on as well, is I know I was looking and I saw that you had written a really fascinating piece on prayers for the dead. And one of the things that I was really struck by is this question of, for all of us who attend shuls across the country, across Pennsylvania, one of the standard things we do in the services is the Misha Berach, where we say the prayer of healing. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about those times when perhaps we may be thinking about those who we love, who may be ill or dying, and we probably, don't necessarily, healing may not be what we are thinking may be the best option for them, but in fact, we may be wanting to think about them being released from the suffering or pain that they may be experiencing. So those are just some of my thoughts, and I think I'll turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Steve and Steve, for these very stimulating responses and questions and provocations. So let's see if I can do some justice to the deep and lengthy issues that you are raising there. So I think that on the issue of transplantation, yes, we do have some texts actually where the rabbis were imagining that it would be possible to move one body part into the body of somebody else and have that be a viable opportunity. And this is found in, for example, xenotransplantation of fetuses. There are midrashim from 1500 years ago of somebody saying, I think it was Leah, or it was Rachel. Rachel was praying that the fetus that is in Leah would move to hers, and the fetus that is in Leah would move to Rachel, and so therefore they would give birth to the proper child in the biblical text. So the rabbis were imagining xenotransplantation of fetuses that we can now almost quite do today. So even though there might not necessarily be halakha, normative texts, there are midrashim, agadot, and stories and other sort of resources, genres that can speak to the contemporary moment, the contemporary technologies and interventions that we're dealing with. So we would have to wrestle with, and this gets to Stephen Berg's question, the question of what is the relationship between classic texts and the modern context? And there are a couple of different attitudes that we can have towards those texts. One is deference. Deference, it means that because somebody at some point in our textual tradition said so, we should do so. And this is a deference to authority because it's found in the Bible, because the rabbi said it in the Talmud, because Joseph Karo said something, or because Moshe Feinstein said something, therefore, dafka, I'm going to do it too. That kind of attitude is definitely found in ancient, medieval, modern and contemporary Jewish experience. So deference is a legitimate attitude. A different kind of attitude would be a little bit more skeptical, that just because there is precedent doesn't necessarily mean that we should be doing it. And we see this as a turn from deference, especially in the early modern period, where Jews were beginning to recognize that, hey, wow, experience can itself be a legitimate source of normative evidence to shape norms for the community. And they did this especially vis-a-vis public health issues. They began to recognize that the experience from the bubonic plague and the Black Death and all of the other public health issues that they were facing at that time period, that they could no longer rely upon Talmudic responses to pandemics. They had to rely upon contemporary evidence and experience. And so there's this turn to resources beyond the textual tradition, if you will. And this has been championed, especially in the last 200 years, where Jews are increasingly returning to scientific evidence for guide, if not norms, for what Jews can and should do. A third attitude is one that I just mentioned, which is analogical reasoning, that there are going to be resources in the classic text whether it's the Bible or the rabbis, even in halakha, that are close to our concerns in the contemporary moment, but not quite. They're not directly speaking to the contemporary issue. And therefore we can sort of squint at it and reason analogically. It shares some of the features, this classic text, with the current context, but it's not 100% the same. And because of those analogical similarities, we can then derive some normative guidance from them. However, an analogical reasoning, while very attractive, and we do it all the time, everywhere, in every aspect of our existence, the challenge there is to justify the relative strength or weakness, not the veracity, but the strength and weakness of the analogy itself. So that's how we can critique fellow Jewish bioethicists and rabbis who are making arguments by analogy, is by arguing to what degree their analogy is strong or weak. And then Stephen Wassner, you also mentioned that when circumstances change, halakha then changes. That is true. And one of the things that has often been invoked in the last 50, 100 years or so is hora'at sha'ah, some sort of emergency situation. Therefore, because the circumstance is so urgent, we will now permit what otherwise would be no longer permitted. And because we're in this exigent or emergent situation, we are given greater licenses and permissions and freedoms that we would otherwise not enjoy. And that's really important. We need to allow ourselves to make emergency rules for emergencies. However, one of the dangers, and especially this is true in the Israeli context, is that we often sit in that status quo and we continue that status quo. And that is one reason why Israel to this day is still in a halachic state of emergency, and it has not reverted back to rules of normal peacetime. And it has allowed itself and arrogated to itself the authority to make certain kinds of rules because it considers itself to be in an emergent situation. I don't want to get into politics, but I do want to acknowledge that there are certain circumstances. Let's say hypothetically a pandemic might all of a sudden sweep across the world. That's an emergent situation which will allow us to make certain kinds of rules that we otherwise wouldn't make in normal public health times. Getting to Stephen Berg's question about praying for death. There are several different prayers for death in the Judaic textual tradition. There are transitive and reflexive. Transitive prayers for death are prayers for somebody else to die. Reflexive prayers are for me to die. And we have evidence of both of those found in the biblical text as well as in rabbinic resources. And in my essay on praying to die, I came across some texts that actually say, not only are you permitted to pray for your own death, not only you're permitted to pray for somebody else to die when it's justifiable, there are circumstances where, in fact, you should pray for somebody to die. You are never allowed to pray for yourself that you must die, but you are obliged to pray for somebody else to die. So a transitive prayer for somebody to die, especially if they are in intractable suffering. And I find that in pastoral settings, that is a very powerful opportunity for family members to hear that it's okay for them to pray for their beloved one who is in intractable suffering, is beyond the care of contemporary medicine, that it's okay for them to pray for that person to die. It doesn't mean that they actually have to push the final dose of morphine. It doesn't mean that they have to unplug the ventilator. It means that they can use another tool in our healthcare repertoire. And prayer was considered theurgic, influencing God to be the ultimate healer. And here, in this instance, influencing God to help this body find its final release. So prayer for death, I think, is a powerful tool that for some of us to consider as a viable option when facing a loved one whose demise is imminent and suffering greatly. So thank you for those conversations. I really welcome the opportunity to hear from the rest of the community here if there are particular questions or concerns or curiosities about these or other issues in Jewish bioethics or Jewish bioethics at the end of life in particular.
We do have a question that came up. What is the Jewish ethical approach to making a decision to save a life at the expense of another's, e.g. only medicine for one? What and who determines who lives and who dies? And I'll leave that to whoever would like to.
To take a quick shot at it. First of all, there is a well-known discussion in the Talmud about two people traveling in the desert with a water bottle for only one. One rabbi said they should both drink and die. And the Rabbi Akiva says, is his blood redder than the other? It's your water bottle. You have no requirement to give up your life for someone else. That's number one. From a medical point of view, there are really two questions there. Number one is the question of triage, say during an emergency. I think it's well accepted that if two patients come in, you choose the one that has the greater chance of living. The other question is, if you've used the last respirator in the hospital and it's on a person with a very low chance, small chance of surviving, and another patient comes in who has a statistically greater chance of surviving, are you allowed to remove the respirator from one and give it to the other? Now, I'm certainly, as I said, not a halakhic expert. I do know what the Orthodox tradition would say about this. And that is that once you have started on the therapy in one person, you are not allowed to remove the respirator from that person to kill him in that sense. You're not just hastening his death because you don't know that he'll die at the very least, although the possibility is higher. Once you've embarked on the course of therapy, you cannot take it for the second person. That, that would be the luck of the draw, and it's in God's hands. Jonathan or Steve, I don't know whether you have any other views or experience or learning about this.
The triage conversation is a hot and heated dynamic conversation among contemporary Jewish bioethicists, especially during the early stages of the COVID pandemic, where emergency rooms were overrun and Jewish physicians and healthcare personnel really were unclear about how to proceed, given limited medical resources, limited time, limited attention, and how to allocate it to people who were similarly sick. And you can find resources among, say, for example, OU, Orthodox Union rulings. You could find them in Tradition magazine, for example, especially by J. David Blake. He's perhaps the leading Orthodox bioethicist today who's written on triage. In the conservative movement, I would recommend looking at works by Daniel Nevins and Elliot Dorff. Those can be found on the Committee for Jewish Law and Standards. And in the Reformed community, I don't know of anybody who's written on triage per se outside of the CCAR's responsa committees. I've touched on it in a few of my pieces here and there. But there's no giant scholar, as far as I know, in the Reformed tradition who's addressed triage. But it is a dynamic and very important conversation.
Okay. What we're talking about a lot here is making a decision, not that's best, but that is least worst. And we have another question about that here. It says, what is the Jewish view about abortion when one person is to be sacrificed either to save the life of a mother or to improve the quality of life for the mother? I'll let that go to anybody.
Well, so abortion again is a hot topic.
We've got another hour.
Yeah, that would be a whole other lecture. But let's put it this way. The Jewish tradition, both normative as well as its lores and legends, its narrative traditions, I would say is a pro-natalist tradition. In other words, the Judaic tradition really wants there to be healthy children and healthy mothers. And from the Talmudic times on, it was understood that a fetus is important, but is not as morally important as the mother herself. And it acquires a moral status as it develops. It is not based on its ontology, but based on its development. So it's not from conception, according to the Catholic tradition, but from how long it's been gestating. And only when it reaches the ring of fire, only when the head is starting to crown in the vaginal canal, only then does it begin to acquire a status very similar to that of the mother. Up to that point, the Jewish sources more or less concur that it is permissible to dispatch of that fetus in order to save the life of the mother. There are contemporary conversations that expand the notion of what it means for the quality for the mother's life. Is it only a physical definition? In other words, would it be that that her life is biologically threatened by this pregnancy, that would then justify terminating the pregnancy? Or could there be emotional or psychical, cognitive dimensions to her well-being? Could those be justificatory enough to justify terminating this particular pregnancy? And in certain traditions, certain communities, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, and a little bit even into the Orthodox arena, there is greater embracement of this idea that the mother's psychical well-being is a valid justification for terminating this particular pregnancy. So this is not to say that abortion can or should be not a contraception, but a way of controlling population. On the contrary, if there are no good reasons to terminate, then there's every good reason to keep a pregnancy going. So again, this is why I would say that Judaism embraces a pro-natalist position, where there is freedom of choice to a certain degree, but that doesn't mean that any choice, any rationale is justification to terminate this particular pregnancy.
Let me add a word to all that was said. While it is true that the killing of an infant, an abortion, is not murder until the majority of the head crowns, as one of my teachers said, it's not nothing. All right, it is a lesser evil, but still an evil, not looked upon well. And certainly it is well accepted, even in the Orthodox view, that mental health is as important as physical health. And most rabbis, I think most Orthodox, if the rabbi had good evidence from physicians, rabbis do not make medical decisions. They take the physician's decision into account. If there's true evidence that this woman would be severely affected mentally by the birth of a child, then generally there is leniency towards abortion. One of the great halachic scholars, Eliezer Waldenberg, said in the case of Tay-Sachs disease, where an infant at this point in our knowledge is really doomed to die within about 2 to 3 years, a very unfortunate death, that abortions up to as far as 7 months would be accepted, which for an Orthodox rabbi of his stature is a significant leniency in there. But again, there is a pro-natalist point of view in Judaism.
Joe, you're muted again.
I know. Okay, we have one more quick question before we wrap up. Is there a literature of Jewish ethics for children and teens?
It's not literature, it's what the parents are doing. Children are observing what parents do all the time. They're observing what adults are doing all the time. And so they're absorbing this all, and that is their text, if you will, for how relationships are handled, how conflict is managed, how emotions can influence one's behavior. So that is, I think, a significant literature that is underappreciated at times. So besides that, that tongue-in-cheek response, a text, a form of literature that younger folks might enjoy would be Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot is a wonderful set of moral maxims that could really be read in Chavruta, so with your child, to have a conversation. I would also recommend the Holiness Code, Leviticus 19. That's also a wonderful set of resources, very short, one sentence or half a sentence, where it says, for example, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. What does that mean? You shall surely rebuke your fellow. Well, what is rebuke? How do you do it? And there's a whole set of literature on those kinds of activities. As for other kinds of lengthier pieces, I'm unfamiliar with great resources on that, on Jewish ethics for children. Perhaps some of you can and should raise your hand and write it.
A few years ago, I was working with a very bright young girl who was getting ready for a bat mitzvah. And I found, and unfortunately I don't have the reference now, but there was a really pretty neat set of, I believe, 3 books, which, would lay out a situation, and, and then you could discuss the ethics involved in it. And then it gave a halachic discussion of it that was, appropriate for that age. I thought it was a really good opportunity, and she loved it. She had a lot of fun with it.
There are wonderful resources when you get into high school and college on ethics. So Prose Door at Hebrew College, they offered a curriculum in Jewish ethics. Lewis Newman's, his Introduction to Jewish Ethics is a fairly thin volume written for an undergraduate audience. I think that high school students could probably access it. So there are some resources of scholarship and curriculum that could be available. But for classic resources, I would start with Leviticus and Pirkei Avot.
All right, well, I guess it is time to wrap up here. This has been a wonderful experience, for me anyway. And I thank all of you for having come here and helped us with this today. And I hope we will do more of this in the future. It has been my pleasure to participate in it and to get to know the 3 of you. Now, all the people who've been watching will receive a brief survey, which we ask you to complete and to give your suggestions for future programs for a community of small congregations. So thank you again for attending, and we're going to keep the Zoom open for about 15 more minutes so there can just be an open chat. Good night, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Whatever it's worth, I thoroughly enjoyed your erudition this evening.